Adolf Hitler had a very clear idea of what he considered to be a model citizen of the Third Reich. For him, a true and loyal Nazi would live and breathe the regime, incorporating it into every aspect of their lives. What they read, how they dressed, and even who they married would all be strictly controlled in order for them to conform to his ideals. In this episode, I'll investigate how Hitler implemented these changes through anti-Semitic clothing laws, the establishment of SS bride schools, and breeding programs that caused over 400,000 children from across occupied Europe to be stolen from their parents. I'll also discover how specialist Nazi academies for the brightest and most promising young German men led to some of the darkest moments of the Second World War. Before Hitler came to power, culture and the arts were flourishing in Germany. Berlin, in particular, had a reputation as a busy hub of music and entertainment. The bars, nightclubs and theatres were full of people expressing their individuality, and one of the ways they did that was through the clothes they wore. The years after the First World War were a boom time for the German fashion industry, and German women were among some of the best dressed in Europe, adopting all the latest styles from Paris, London and New York. But there was one man who didn't like that one little bit, and that was Adolf Hitler. And when he came to power, he was determined to standardize the German fashion industry. Shortly after coming to power in 1933, the Nazis set about boycotting Jewish businesses in Germany. And one of the areas singled out was the clothing and fashion sector. I've come to the Textile and Industry Museum in Augsburg to meet with Claudia Gottfried, curator of a fascinating new exhibition that recently opened here. It looks like we've got some clothes that look pretty conservative. Where are they from or who are they made by?
These are clothes of the ADEFA. It was a Nazi organization. They wanted to create an only German fashion industry without any Jewish influence.
The working group of German Aryan manufacturers, more commonly known by its German language acronym ADEFA, was established by Nazi Party members with financial interests in the fashion industry.
They wanted to try to make a new fashion style and not French fashion.
Right.
And they didn't get it. And there's no Jewish influence, not in no part of the production.
Hitler, he had very strong views on what women should wear. He believed that they should wear Germanic clothes, by which he meant made in Germany with German textiles, and also made by people who weren't Jewish. Now, this was a huge problem because 97% of the textile trade in Germany was Jewish.
They hoped that by uniting purely German-run clothing companies, they could work together to exclude Jewish-owned firms from the industry altogether.
They tried it for a few years. They made fashion shows and created some German fashion, but it did not work.
They were going back to designs, for example, of trying to encourage people to wear the Dirndl, which is the traditional German peasant-style dress. And so it kind of almost went against the grain of the regime's beliefs for a Jew to be making those kinds of costumes.
Over 600 German clothing companies had signed up to ADEFA, all of whom were required to sew the label into their garments and to display a sign in their shop which read, Ware aus arischer Hand, made by Aryan hands. But boycotting Jewish businesses was only part of the reason for controlling how people dressed.
At first, they were not interested only to create a new German fashion. That was not the main interest. Rather, they were economic interests.
The Nazis wanted to stop citizens of the Third Reich relying on expensive foreign imports, such as cotton, silk, and lace. This was just a small part of Hitler's bigger plan to make Germany self-sufficient in preparation for war.
They introduced a comprehensive system of regulations to control the textile consumption. The main point was to replace the natural fibers by artificial fiber. The Nazis had a lot of problems with textile. Textile were rare, expensive, and most of the raw materials had to be imported. And that cost a lot of foreign currencies. And they needed the foreign currencies for the armor.
While the Nazis worked hard to promote the idea to the average person that wearing simple, modest, German-made clothes was an act of patriotism, many of the members of the Nazi elite simply couldn't do without their favourite designers. Oh wow, this feels like we're moving into a completely different world. This feels more like Hollywood than what we've just been looking at.
Yeah, these are the dresses of the Nazi upper class. And they were still wearing international fashion, French fashion, and they have been buying their clothes in Paris, dresses from the great couturiers from there.
There's a double standard behind all these dresses, isn't there?
Yeah, we call it, they were preaching water and were drinking wine.
Eventually, although not immediately, women had to abandon Jewish designers. So through the 30s, the senior wives, Mrs. Goering, Mrs. Goebbels, were still quite faithful to their Jewish designers and still wore their creations. But the ordinary German women were not buying Jewish fashion anymore.
When Magda Goebbels realised her favourite Jewish designers were to go out of business, she simply replied, "Elegance will now disappear from Berlin, along with the Jews." But the Nazis hadn't completely removed Jewish involvement from the industry. Horrifyingly, they played an integral role in the development of the German footwear industry.
This is one of the best and one of the horrible examples for the connection between politics and fashion. It's telling the story about the shoe test track in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. In order to research new material for shoe soles, they built a technical complex in concentration camp Sachsenhausen, and they built it with the knowledge and participation of the whole German shoe industry.
Some of the inmates at Sachsenhausen would be forced to walk up to 48 kilometres per day around a specially designed multi-surface track in shoes that were often several sizes too small.
They ruined their health, and many find death on this track.
So people died testing shoes.
Yes.
For the German shoe industry.
Yes.
The Nazis had been brought to power on Hitler's promise to tackle unemployment and stabilise the country and its economy. He had promised men they'd feel proud again, told young people that they were an asset to their country, and told women that they had a vital role to play in the development of the Third Reich.
Before Hitler came to power, the Nazi Party didn't receive that much acclaim or attention from women, but once the Depression really hit Germany very hard and they were very much concerned about trying to get food on the table, and Hitler was promising jobs and economic recovery, then the number of women voting for Hitler increased. They found him interesting, eccentric, a little bit odd, and he kind of added this frisson of excitement. The charisma that he showed really attracted a lot of people to him.
It's phenomenal how popular Hitler was amongst women. He had more fan mail from women than the Beatles and Mick Jagger rolled into one. He was absolutely inundated with gifts. Women would send him baby booties and cakes and, lots and lots of love letters and let me bear your child for you, mein Führer. And his popularity was more amongst women than amongst men. And of course, they used this.
Before the Nazis took control, women's rights in Germany was some of the most progressive in Europe. But Hitler had a very clear idea of the role he wanted women to perform. This was, first and foremost, to be the loyal wife of a Nazi husband and the mother of as many pure-blood German children as possible. The drive to increase the number of Aryan children had profound effects on the role of women. Hitler himself said that, for a woman, her world is her husband, her family, her children, and her home. And so, in 1936, Heinrich Himmler issued a decree that said that the wives of SS men should be trained to adhere to strict Nazi standards. On Himmler's orders, the First Reich Bride School was established in 1937. There, women were moulded into model Nazi wives, taught the importance of race and genetics, and above all, to pledge allegiance to Adolf Hitler.
It was a residential school. You went for 6 weeks and you stayed there, and at the end of it you had to take a certificate. You had to learn all sorts of things like cooking and childcare and how to obey a man properly. You had to pass an intensive physical, which would measure all your facial features and the colour of your eyes. And so you were very, very scrutinised. And you also had to provide records of your great-grandparents so that there was no suggestion of any mixed blood. You were absolutely pure Aryan. So the bride schools, there were 8 of them eventually, all over Germany. And they were seen as this very important training ground for women to marry into the SS.
But while the Nazi Party had very strong views on how its citizens should live their married lives, as so often with Nazism, that didn't apply to those in charge.
Hitler couldn't marry. Hitler was seen to be married to Germany, and he couldn't be seen with a girlfriend, even though he had one. So Eva Braun, who was his secret girlfriend, was kept very, very concealed most of the time down in Munich. Nobody ever saw her. And so it's completely hidden from the German people until very, very late on in the war that Hitler even had a kind of female interest. The purpose of this was to deflect any idea that Hitler cared for one woman more than anybody else.
But for Hitler, it wasn't just about controlling marriage. It was about controlling the children that would result from those marriages. If the Nazis were going to grow and expand their empire, they would need future generations of loyal Aryan children to grow up and to continue the cause.
Nazism is based on the concept of an existential threat. In other words, the idea that the Aryan race is facing extinction. We must stop it, we must resurrect it. We must have huge numbers of children.
But the children born from married couples alone were not sufficient to increase the birth rate required by the Nazis. So Himmler decided to establish a state-run organization known as Lebensborn.
The Lebensborn was an organization called the Well of Life, or the Fountain of Life, that's how it translates. And it was an organization that allowed let's say, young girls who were single and pregnant to carry their baby to term and to give birth in a very discreet place.
The Nazis were mad keen on increasing Germany's population, and it didn't matter whether it was in wedlock or out of wedlock. And the Lebensborn were really sort of SS maternity homes.
Lebensborn provided welfare for unmarried mothers, who they deemed to be pure Aryans and racially hygienic, and would often facilitate the adoption of these children to childless parents, who they also deemed to be racially pure.
The idea was that Germany would plan to have children who were born out of wedlock, for example, or maybe they were orphans for one reason or another. But if they were Aryans, he wanted them to be integrated into German society and become part of the master race.
The programme was not just confined to Germany. It was eventually rolled out across occupied Europe, and around 20,000 children were born as a result. One of these was Gisela Heidenreich. She was born under the Lebensborn programme in 1943 in the Norwegian capital, Oslo, while it was under Nazi control.
My mother was a tall, very good-looking woman, not really blonde, but a little bit darker, what you called dark blonde, which was still okay, and blue-eyed. And she went to Bad Tölz, where there was a Junkerschule, which means a school of SS officers. And there she met my father. For some years he was a commander of this officer school. And she was his secretary, so you could even think it was like a love affair. But he was married and he had already 2 sons. Himmler said an SS man, who of course should be blonde, blue-eyed and so on, which my father really was. Those who have this physical attributes should be the ones who have the more children than within their marriage.
Himmler believed that the occupied Scandinavian countries, such as Norway, provided a particularly suitable gene pool for the production of Aryan children.
It was 40,000 occupants of German soldiers. They had the idea that those German soldiers should have love affairs with Norwegian women to get as many as so-called Nordic children to be brought back to Germany and to be adopted here by SS officers or SS families. For the SS officers, it was like an order. But for the women, it was like they got an award.
It was definitely an intention of the Nazi regime to try and increase the nation's population. And there were incentives for this. So there was the Cross of Honor for the German mother, and this was awarded in bronze, silver, and gold for 4, 6, and 8 children, respectively, as a kind of symbolic tribute to motherhood.
But for many of these children, the circumstances under which they were born went on to have profound effects in their later lives.
I feel horrible. And I mean, this is what I know from others also, because I know many of them who never talked about it. They came out and showed their shame and their guilt. You feel guilty being the idea, the crazy idea of mad brains to produce a special race because this race should be more precious than others. We are kind of the other part of Holocaust. There should be one race should be produced, and the others who were not as precious were killed.
Some of the darkest moments in Germany's history were caused by Hitler's quest for racial purity, simply because he chose to believe that all true Germanic Aryans should have blonde hair and blue eyes. To promote this ideal, a competition was launched to find the most beautiful Aryan baby. And here is the winner, selected by Joseph Goebbels himself, 6-month-old Hesse Taft. Her image went on to adorn propaganda campaigns all over the Reich. However, this poster child for the biologically superior Aryan race had a bit of a secret. She was Jewish. The Nazis had realized that their plans to conquer Europe, and possibly even the world, was going to take generations to achieve. So while the production of Aryan children was of paramount importance, so too was their education.
The role for women, actually, in terms of rearing their children and bringing them up in the Nazi era, was very much to imbue the next generation with German culture, with German traditions, whether that's literature or art, but also with Nazi ideology, so that they would be the future generation of soldiers.
Every apparatus of education and indoctrination was used by the Nazis. Boys and girls joined the Hitler Youth or the League of German Maidens. It was German teachers' organisation.
A lot of the areas of life that we would consider the private sphere, actually the Nazis penetrated those areas. So into the family, into traditional education. There was a lot of indoctrination from quite early on in young people's lives.
Hitler recognised that if you condition people very, very early on, from the crib onwards, then you have control of them, or you can attempt to have control of them.
Education in the Third Reich served to promote Nazism and National Socialist views. Teachers spoke of the superiority of the Aryan and Nordic races, while denouncing Jews and Slavs as parasitic and racially unclean.
If you look at the school books of children of that era, you would have maths problems. It costs 500 marks to keep a disabled child in an institution for a year. How many poor families could be fed with that money? There's always this slant.
Mothers were also encouraged to continue their children's education at home.
The bride schools that women who were marrying into the SS had to attend, one of the things that they learned was how to teach prayers to your children, and you would pray not to Our Father, but to Our Führer. How to adopt fairy stories so that they had the correct National Socialist spin. If you were telling a child Cinderella, the handsome prince would be a stormtrooper, and the ugly sisters would be ugly not because they didn't look good, but because they were Slavs. Of course, it's how totalitarian societies work. You make sure that you keep people absolutely fixed at every moment of the day on your message, and that is what the Nazis were very successful at doing.
For the Nazi regime to control every aspect of people's lives, from what they wore to who they married and how they even raised their children, they needed a way to enforce these policies. Citizens of the Third Reich lived in constant fear of the Gestapo. This was, of course, the secret state police, the job of which was to enforce National Socialist ideology and to crush ruthlessly any opposition to the regime.
There were various branches of the German police, but before the Nazis there was no such thing as the Gestapo. This was an entirely new concept in Germany, that there would be a division of the police which would keep tabs on political dissent and political conformity among the general population.
Anyone suspected of acting against Nazi doctrine could be arrested and held indefinitely, without trial, while they were interrogated. The Gestapo headquarters in Cologne is just one of many locations where such interrogations took place. They were often brutal ordeals, where severe beatings and psychological torture were typical of the methods employed. There are two things that really strike you when you're walking in a place like this. Not only are these Gestapo cells, But what you also notice is that at the top of them, they're little windows. Now, those windows, you can see people walking past, going about their daily business. And that would be especially chilling for someone incarcerated in here, but also especially chilling for those walking past, because they could hear what was going on in here, the tortures, the screams, the shouts, the crying. And the Gestapo didn't care if people heard that. In fact, it added to it. It added to the sense of terror. The Gestapo was given the authority to investigate matters of treason, dissent, and acts of sabotage against the Nazi regime. They had the power to operate above the law, exempt from all responsibility, and they were legally untouchable. Dr. Thomas Rutt is a historian working at the Gestapo Documentation Center. Would this be fairly typical of a Gestapo cell throughout the Third Reich?
Ja, auf jeden Fall. Also jede Gestapo-Zentrale hatte diese Kellerzellen. Da waren die Menschen untergebracht, wenn sie verhört wurden oder verhaftet worden waren, bevor sie dann weiter in die Zuchthäuser, Gefängnisse und Konzentrationslager deportiert wurden. Die Verpflegung war schlecht, die Zellen waren oft überfüllt und am Ende des Krieges gab es sehr viele Seuchen in den Gefängnissen.
The Gestapo obviously has a terrible reputation. Was that deserved?
Ja, auf jeden Fall. Also die Gestapo war eine normale Polizeibehörde und eine normale Verwaltung, aber sie war vor allem ein Terrorapparat. Und üblich bei der Gestapo war, dass die Gefangenen ohne gerichtliche Kontrolle einfach willkürlich verhaftet wurden, dass sie in KZs gesteckt wurden und dass sie bei Verhören eigentlich immer wieder auf brutalste Art und Weise misshandelt wurden.
Was Gestapo in every town, every village in the Third Reich?
Die waren vor allem in den großen Städten, wie hier in Köln. Da waren sie zentriert, aber sie hatten auch in diesen großen Städten nicht viele Mitarbeiter. Hier in Köln gab es 100 bis 120 Mitarbeiter. Und mit diesen Leuten allein hätten sie die Bevölkerung gar nicht überwachen können. Also waren sie angewiesen auf die Kooperation von anderen Behörden. Und die haben sozusagen ein Netz der Verfolgung gesponnen, auf das die Gestapo dann zurückgreifen konnte.
Citizens of Nazi Germany lived in utter fear of what they considered to be an all-seeing and all-knowing Nazi secret police. And it was this fear that the Gestapo came to rely on. The reality was that there were often fewer than 50 Gestapo agents operating in any one town or city across Germany.
It was a sneak system. That's how everything was done. It was done by denunciation. If, for example, a woman in a neighboring flat you thought was a bit odd and strange, didn't have a boyfriend, and you told your suspicions to the Gestapo, they'd come and take her away. Anyone who just seemed a bit out of the ordinary was under suspicion. And yes, children could denounce parents, denounce relatives, denounce friends. This is how Nazi Germany operated. That was its organizing principle, denunciation.
The Gestapo relied on tip-offs from the local population, which shows that in a way the local population collaborated with them.
Also es gibt Bereiche der staatspolizeilichen Verfolgung, die wären ohne Unterstützung aus der Bevölkerung, ohne Unterstützung der Volksgenossen, ohne Denunziation gar nicht möglich gewesen. Also Nachbarn, die ihre Nachbarn anschwärzen, Leute, die auf dem Arbeitsplatz jemanden anderen über die Regierung reden hören und dann zur Gestapo laufen, Ehepartner, die übereinander herziehen. Das war ein ganz wichtiges Informationssystem für die Gestapo, ohne die Gestapo nicht so effektiv gewesen wäre.
Only 10% of Gestapo investigations were initiated by the Gestapo themselves. The rest relied on information provided by members of the public. How important was the Gestapo for the Third Reich's hold on power?
Ganz zentral. Also ohne den Terror, ohne die Angst, die die Gestapo in der Bevölkerung hervorgerufen hat, aber auch ohne den Verfolgungsdruck, die Brutalität gegenüber dem Widerstand, hätte das Dritte Reich nicht so lange halten können.
So had the war continued or gone the way that Hitler wanted it to go, the Gestapo would have got bigger and bigger, yes?
Ja, also die Idee war, dass die Gestapo sozusagen als allgemeiner Sicherheitsapparat die gesamte Gesellschaft überwachen sollte und vor allem die Gesellschaft reinigen, säubern sollte von all jenen, die das Dritte Reich nicht haben wollte. Juden, Linke, Christen, Ausländer, alle diese sollten von der Gestapo überwacht oder aus der Gesellschaft ausgesondert werden.
But while the regime had managed to establish its doctrine and maintain control of the people in Germany, Hitler's plans to roll out the same process across Europe was going to require a generation of young, loyal, and obedient leaders to implement his Nazi ideology. I'm here at the Ordensburg Vogelsang in northwest Germany. Now, this was one of 3 fake castles that the Nazis built in order to train their future leaders. One of the most important components of that education was the whole notion of racial superiority. And as we shall see, it's that indoctrination that will end up having a devastating effect in the years to come. Ordensburg schools were established to provide a system of education and indoctrination to specially selected young men from across the Reich in the hope of turning them into future Nazi leaders. I've been joined by historian Stefan Wunsch, who's kindly offered to tell me more about the people who came here.
These were young guys in the middle of their 20s, all of them NS, National Socialist activists. Most of them were coming from the lower ranks or middle ranks of society, and they were craftsmen and office clerks and jobs like that they had learned. So no academics, or not many.
So what qualified them to come here?
They were chosen. That's part of the construction of an elite. They were trained to feel them superior to others. That's part of the attraction, being part of the superior master race. And they believed we will share in the power of the National Socialist regime. Someday we will be rulers too, small Hitlers.
The majority of the curriculum here was based on physical education and exercise. But much emphasis was also put on the teaching of geopolitics and the Nazi ideals of race and superiority. Do you think there would have been more Ordensburgs like this had the war gone on, or had the Third Reich lasted for longer?
Well, the idea was intended to build the castles larger. What you have of Vogelsang today is nearly 1/3 of what was planned. What was interesting, they tried to change the system. They tried to begin with young boys, being 12 years old, and to keep them until they're in their 20s. And that would have been a problem, because they would have been completely socialized in this elite education.
Many of the young men who attended Vogelsang were eventually sent to the east during the war, taking with them what they had learned here, with devastating consequences.
There are several hundreds of them who were sent to Poland in political jobs as as modern colonizators, ruling Poland and then ruling Belarus, Ukraine, and Baltic states. A lot of them are part of the Holocaust, being partly responsible or being responsible for a lot of the mass shootings in Eastern Europe in the 1940s. They were ghetto chiefs and jobs like that. If we take a close look at the sources we have, like diaries or letters by them, Everything what they did in Eastern Europe shows a habit of I'm superior, I am more worth than the Polish people or the Ukrainian people, and especially as the Jews.
Although the war would put an end to the Ordensburg program, in many ways it was remarkably successful. Many young men were indoctrinated into Nazism before the war, such as those at the SS training schools and the Adolf Hitler schools. But those here at Ordensburg, those would remain Nazis to the very end of their days. The indoctrination was utterly complete. Hitler didn't want Nazism to be confined to just Germany alone. He had much bigger plans to spread his ideology and the Aryan master race across Nazi-conquered Europe. But he had a problem. What to do with those he considered to be the racially inferior peoples in the territories he invaded? The process to deal with the subjugated peoples of Central and Eastern Europe was known as Generalplan Ost, the General Plan for the East. This was a top-secret plan for the deportation of entire populations that didn't match the Nazi ideals and the subsequent colonization of occupied territory with ethnic Germans. The plan was based on the Nazi policy of Lebensraum, the colonization of invaded territories by ethnically pure Germans. It was split into two main objectives: the removal of non-Aryans, known as the Small Plan, then replacing them with German settlers, known as the Big Plan.
The General Plan Ost was a plan for genocide, for ethnic cleansing on a monstrous scale, and really to create a massive German empire.
The Nazis' racial views were a key deciding factor on who would be allowed to stay in the newly Germanized territories and who would have to go.
Hitler had this idea that it wasn't just the Jews who were a problem to be eradicated, but there were all kinds of what he called Untermenschen, especially what he called Slavic people. He said that there could be 30 million of these subhumans. We've got to deal with that, and we'll deal with that through eradication of them.
So, if you were Czech, you were probably okay. If you were Estonian, you were earmarked for resettlement. Lots of Latvians were also deemed to be of sufficient racial stock. Lithuanians, however, were deemed to have too much Slavic blood, so they would have been deported to the east. An equally devastating fate also lay in store for the people of Poland. By 1941, the Nazis had decided that within 10 to 20 years, the Polish people, their history, their culture would simply cease to exist. And for those who were not either killed or deported, but were able to work, the plan for them was to stay on and live in servitude to their new German settlers.
His intention was to let the surviving Slavs inhabiting those lands be a race of slaves, be a race of helots, if you like, under the supervision of German settlers, German colonizers who would have the whip hand.
The timescale for the big plan was 25 to 30 years. And by that point, 45 million so-called non-Germanizable people from Central and Eastern Europe would be removed, and 14 million would remain as slaves. And in their place, 8 to 10 million Germans would be settled in an extended policy of Lebensraum.
Hitler was legitimating the whole idea by saying, well, these places had once hosted German communities. Therefore, we're not doing anything actually outrageous. But of course, it did mean that all those other cultures would be exterminated culturally and in many ways physically as well.
But the Nazis had a problem. There were simply not enough Aryan Germans to replace the vast areas they were intending to ethnically cleanse. So they decided to bend their own rules on race.
Himmler set up secret plans to provide something called the Germanization program, whereby children would be taken from their parents if they conformed to an Aryan ideal.
With this particular program, you looked for the physical evidence and you just went about stealing these children because they were blonde, they looked Germanic, therefore you take them and Germanize them.
What the Nazis did when they went to the areas that they occupied in Poland and other parts of Europe, they abducted or took away children from their family if they thought that they were of good racial stock, and they could depolonize them or make them German.
The idea was, they'd go through local children, families and so on, and they say, right, okay, there's a nice blonde child there, right? You go over that side. Oh, there's a nice blonde kid there, yeah? You go over that side. I don't think it was very scientific. Remember, Nazi racial theory wasn't very scientific. If they could see people who looked as if they were Aryan stock, just visually, speaks German, is blonde, looks a bit Nordic, let's have them in the people's community.
Although the Nazis wanted to eradicate the Polish nation because of its so-called racial inferiority, they were perfectly happy to steal their children, bring them up in Germany, and proudly call them Aryans.
They regarded the Poles as subhuman and inferior and all of those kinds of things. If they took these children away, they could somehow save them and create racially valuable Germans now for the future.
They would be put in institutions and taught to speak German and to forget their Polish heritage and to forget their Polish name, and they would eventually be adopted by SS families.
Children were taken from all the occupied territories. They were ripped from their families and sent to Germany to be turned into the next generation of Nazis.
400,000 plus children were brought into the Reich. If they failed the tests, if they were assessed and considered inadequately Aryan, they were sent to camps. So it was a terrible ordeal all round.
Many of the parents were never to see their children again, and they lived out their lives never knowing the fates of their sons and daughters. Ultimately, Hitler's quest to expand his empire and ideology across the world led to death, destruction, and human suffering on a truly terrifying scale. The totalitarian control he held over the German people allowed him to instill in them the Nazi doctrines of racial purity and hierarchy. These ideas would ultimately form the basis for one of the darkest periods in the history of the world.